Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you for being with us today. My name is Julia Paivina. Is the voice fine? Is everything's fine? Oh, there's some strange voice.
Okay, everyone. Hello. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you being with us today. My name is Aminuddin Baharudin, and I will be your host for today's podcast. And we appreciate you taking your time off your busy schedule to be with us today. We hope that you find this session is as informational as it is entertaining. So the podcast today is an initiative taken by the IUMW's Center of Foundation Studies to discuss and talk about a very in topic right now, a very current topic right now, which is racism. But from a very interesting perspective, how is racism enforced by poetry? Not enforced meaning encouraged, but is affected by the field of poetry. And being a multicultural and multiracial country ourselves, Malaysia, racism is no stranger. I believe that equality of all races should be preached throughout the nation, and I definitely hope that this webinar is a stepping stone towards that, fulfilling that motion. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our prestigious guest for today, Dr. Sheena Baharudin. Welcome, Dr. Sheena.
Hello. Hi, how are you, Amin?
I'm doing great. How are you today?
I'm doing good. I am drinking coffee, so everything should be okay.
Okay, so does that coffee mean that how's your day been treating you?
How's my day? Well,
Yeah.
aside from feeding my cats and feeding my fishes, I am okay. I'm just doing a lot of work, a lot of research stuff on the side. But of course, I mean, today, the only thing that I was looking forward to was this particular session.
Oh, thank
So,
you so
yes.
much. Okay, so on behalf of CFS, we are very honored to hear that. So before we actually dive into the topic, would you like to give a brief introduction about yourself to our viewers right now?
Okay, yeah, sure. So, hello everyone. Hi, I'm very happy to be here. So, my name is Sheena Bahardin, and I am a poet educator. And basically, what that means is, well, I guess for the past 10 years, I have been writing and performing and doing projects that are related to poetry, as well as, I guess I teach poetry as well. So, right now, I'm teaching poetry at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, where I teach creative writing as well as literature. Hello, everyone.
So has it always been about poetry? Like from your education, does your degree and master's all started in arts? How
Oh,
long have
yeah.
you been diving into poetry, basically?
You mean how long have I been a full-on nerd?
A poetry nerd, sure.
Yeah, full-on poetry nerd. Okay, so even before I did my undergraduate and postgraduate in literature, I have always been into poetry. I'm not into science back then. Now I am, because I just found out. Well, not I just found out. I mean, I have rediscovered this whole thing, this whole world of poetry and science, which is a great topic that you might want to explore in one of your future seminars. But anyway, yeah. So I did my undergraduate in English language and literature at the International Islamic University in Malaysia. I did my postgraduate there as well. I just finished my PhD in Malaysian literature at the University of Nottingham, and I don't want to study anymore.
But right now, correct
Yeah.
me if I'm wrong, but you're at the end of your PhD, right?
Yeah, I am submitting my thesis correction. So I'm done with my Viva. So Alhamdulillah, that's
Alhamdulillah.
done. Yeah, Alhamdulillah.
And your PhD is also about poetry, is it?
Yes.
About literature.
Yes. Well, of course, it's about literature, but specifically, it looks into performance poetry as a form of storytelling. So that's my thesis.
Okay, great. So you had a brief slide to share with us today. Would
Oh,
you like to
yeah.
share with us now? Yeah.
Okay.
That'll be
All
good.
right. So let me share with y'all. Chrome tabs. Okay. Share. Hold on. Let me just put this on the side. Alrighty. Okay, so I guess once you change the layout, you'll be able to see the slides. Present. Yeah, okay, so it's up now. Okay, so I have a feeling that you might not be able to see. There you go, and now you can see it. So I whipped up this very simple slides just to let everybody know here, all of you beautiful souls right now who is watching this visual podcast. Exactly where I am coming from as a poet, especially when it comes to dealing with topics that are very crucial and very important to us right now, which is racism and exactly how to address racism and what we can actually do about it. So here is where I'm coming from. So I'll just show you 2 slides, and that's about it. So let me see. Okay. So first one, let's do a quick breakdown because after this, Mr. Aminuddin will be asking quite a number of questions. I'll be having a great conversation about it. If you guys have any questions as well, you can put it in the comments. But here is a quick breakdown of the reason why I put the title as such, which is Confronting Racism with Poetry. So I've broken it down to 3 parts just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Number one, when we talk about confronting, we're talking about facing up to an issue whether or not we are aware of it, an issue that maybe we have heard of, maybe we have experienced it ourselves, maybe those that we have read up about, especially what's happening in the United States of America, with the death of George Floyd and so on. So we're talking about facing up to an issue, but not just facing up to it, but also be part of a solution. So exactly how do we tackle this existing problem that we are experiencing at the moment? So that's one. And then of course, we'll be looking at racism. I guess the easiest way for us to understand racism is to come up with this particular way of looking at the world and looking at the world and the people around us and thinking that I am better than you. The minute when we say that, it doesn't matter. It could be because of their cultural background, just because that they are different, and usually it has something to do with their racial sort of history, racial identity, and so on and so forth. And then this is where we have shows of prejudice, discrimination, as well as shows of antagonistic sort of attitude towards this other person without even knowing who they are. So that's racism. And last but not least, we are looking at poetry, which is basically a creative form of self-expression. And just to remind all of you that there are so many branches of poetry out there. So what poetry is, it's basically a way of expressing yourself creatively by using the medium of language. So that's a quick breakdown. And for me, who I have been completely obsessed with words for as long as I can remember, how do I see poetry does influence a lot in how I use it to address issues that do matter to me, not only as Malay or Muslim, but also as Malaysian, as well as being a woman, and so on and so forth. So number one, I use it as a tool. So basically, poetry is not my world. It's not only about poetry. It's something that I use for an intended purpose. And usually, of course, we're talking about storytelling. So storytelling, I can tell my story, but if the people around me, especially when I perform them, if they cannot relate to me, I guess there is a dissonance there. Basically, something that is personal should also be communal. It's something that is meant to be shared. So that's how I view poetry as well. And when we talk about communal, then of course we're talking about the human experience. So it does not matter where you are from and who you are. I guess every single one of us has fallen down, scraped our knees, cried, fall in love, and so on and so forth, which is part of the human experience. But the fourth one is particularly important, however, because I guess nowadays our impression of poetry tends to range from number one, poetry is elitist, poetry is not for me, or I'm not good with language, of why should I learn poetry or read poetry, to another, I guess another part, the other side of the range, which is poetry is everything, and without poetry life is meaningless. Obviously, that's not where I'm coming from. How I see poetry is that it is a radical tool. So when we talk about radical, we're talking about something that is geared towards social change. And we are not changing everything, but rather using it to change things that we see that is wrong in our community or in our society. So that's what it means, yeah, radical. It is also dynamic, it changes all the time, it's not static. Anything that is static tends to stink, right? Stagnant water stinks, so it needs to move and change and morph. And last but not least, again, I guess it's an emphasis on the fact that whoever writes poetry comes from a specific background. So of course, we tend to have things that make us who we are, but at the same time, there are also aspects of us in our writing and the way that the stories that we share that will be universal as well. So all of the six components tend to come together, and they are definitely cohesive. They're the same thing, and that's how I use poetry to address and confront racism, which is what we'll be talking about today. And that is it, Mr. Aminuddin. The first three slides. I'm going to
Okay.
stop sharing.
So you definitely made poetry sound very cool. It sounded
It is cool.
awesome.
It is
So
cool.
I've been trying to go into poetry, but what I found was that if I'm interested in learning guitar, then I'll just Google a guitar tutorial. If I'm interested in learning about some science, I can buy a book. But if I'm interested in poetry, like how do I start? For example, a very common excuse is I'm not really good in English. My Malay is not so good, so literature is not for me.
Right.
Yeah, so how do you get into poetry?
Well,
How, okay, or better, how did you get into poetry?
how did I get into poetry? So, okay, so this is a really, I guess, one way for me to connect with you in terms of how I see poetry and how I got myself into poetry is through music. I started poetry because I wanted to write my own music. And of course, you have to write lyrics. And lyrics is basically a version of poetry. We have something called lyrical poetry. But yeah, and then prior to that, I was into diary writing, I was into my novel writing. But what really got me into it is the fact that there are so many words that are used, but people don't mean it. So by putting a little bit more awareness into how every single word matters, that really got me into poetry. But that's of course me talking, for myself lah.
And if we were to like go back maybe around 2,000 years ago, the word poetry,
I'll try.
okay, been there. So 2,000 years ago, the word poetry actually comes from the word poeo. Okay, when I first heard the word poeo, being a Malay, it's quite funny, poeo.
Yeah,
But it actually means I create,
yeah,
creating something.
yeah.
And originally, poetry is not a medium to deliver message. It's basically a medium that we emphasize on how aesthetic, the aesthetic quality of the word, how pretty language is. But as time goes by, it started to have more of its function. We started to focus on the semantics rather than the aesthetics. And then we'll start to see poetry being used to deliver, or not to deliver, to record historical information. And then even during the times of the ancient Egypt, or even the recent times in our prophet, okay, Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even poetry is being used to spread news
Right.
and propaganda. So poetry has had a place in our civilization for thousands and thousands of years. But only around from the year 2000, we started to see a rise in events such as performance poetry. and then freestyling, and even rap means rhythm
Mm-hmm.
and poetry, or rhyming and
Mm-hmm.
poetry. And then we
Mm-hmm.
have all these events which you have been a part of, which is the slam poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these events have brought us to where we are now, in which poetry is no longer elitist, as I would say. It's no longer something that only a special few will able to indulge on. So
Right.
that leads us to my question. So what is good poetry? If you talk about good research paper, it means the findings. A good music, how catchy it is. But what is good poetry? Is it how beautiful the language is, or is it how meaningful the message is? Personally, for you.
Okay. Well, before I answer that question, I mean, I do have to respond to a few of the things that you have mentioned, just so that it gives more context to the sort of answer that I'll be giving you. So
Yeah.
when you mention about how the word poetry itself, it is rooted in the word poio or poesis, which means to
Mm,
create, right? What a lot of people tend not, well, I guess a lot of people do not have the awareness that, especially during the Greek civilization, and the Roman civilization, and so on and so forth, the idea of poetry is not exactly like how we think it is. We tend
mm,
to think that poetry, it looks a certain way, it's usually short, and poetry is different from theater, poetry is different from dance. But at that time, when they talk about poesis, they're referring to all creative expressions. There are
mm,
no division. Now, from that, I actually read up a couple of scientific journal articles that say that our brain is inclined to classify. It's almost as if it's an innate trait of a human being, just because it kind of makes it a little bit more manageable to experience whatever that we have around the world, right?
mm,
So we tend to classify and categorize, and I think somewhere along the line we wanted to categorize poetry as its own, when the fact that it shouldn't be, because as you say, it's all about to to create something that is beautiful,
mm,
something that is going to get people's attention. Hence the reason why, as civilization progresses, poetry has always been there and has a specific purpose or a specific function. But regardless of what the versions or or the purposes and how it goes from one empire to another, it has always been there. And I think it has something to do with the fact that that was the way that we communicate. How do we differentiate from how we would speak to a friend of ours, and how we would speak in front of an audience, or in front of a group of people that we want to get their attention from? So the way that we say things would be very different.
mm,
It's highly stylized. I don't know whether you know this, but Plato, which is basically the teacher, right, the teacher of Aristotle,
mm, mm, mm.
he actually said that poets should be banished from the state,
Oh,
because yeah,
why?
so there's no such thing as elitists there. We are basically the rebels. Poets are the rebels. Because Plato says that poets, by the end of it, there's no function in a nation state. And that is so interesting, because now whenever we talk about literature and poetry, we always go back to that time and say, that is the golden time. But that's
Yeah.
not it. Yeah. So coming back to your question,
Mm.
uh, so is it only about the way
The
it looks like,
semantics,
or
yeah.
is it the
The
content?
meaning, yeah.
What is good poetry? I would say, like, I did my whole thesis on what is good poetry, and it really depends
Mm,
on the place and the time that you are in. It tends to change. What was considered good in the 18th century might no longer be considered good now. But I have always believed that it is a merging of several qualities. So you have, the idea of something that is beautiful, you have something that has good purposes, good intention, and very effective. AFFECTIVE, not effective, but effective as well.
mm.
So yeah, that's my answer.
Okay, so thank you. And I, I've been doing some research on all this, like great poetry. I wanted to know what great poetries are, or great
Mm,
poets are. So
mm.
recently, in the year 2000,
Wow,
recently
okay.
meaning now lah, okay. So now,
Not 20 years ago.
we have a Pulitzer Prize winner, which
Mm,
is Jericho, if I'm not mistaken. The name is Jericho. So he wrote. So he won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, a collection of poetry, which is called The Tradition. And I read some of them, and I had no idea what message was being delivered, but it made me feel something, which is really
Ooh,
weird. Because I
effective.
feel,
That's
yeah, very
what I'm talking
effective.
about.
I
Yeah.
had no idea what it meant, but I was heavily impacted. And it made me curious, like what is the author trying to say? And have you had any of these instances where your messages or your meaning is lost in translation to your audience?
Okay, that's the reason why I really feel that intention is really important, because the minute when you publish a work, the minute when you perform a poem, you have no control over exactly how it's going to be received and understood.
Mm-mm.
But I always believe, again, I've had conversations with other poets who disagreed with me. They say, well, intention is not important. But I'm like, nah, intention is important because you no longer own your work once it's out there. So in the case of Jericho's poem, that book, and then you were reading his poem, you knew that you're feeling something. You're not really sure what he was trying to say, but you felt it. That's you responding to the text.
Yes.
Jericho was just, the medium from whatever inspiration that he had to the form of that poem on page.
Mm-mm-mm-mm. True.
Yeah.
Yeah. And here's the thing. Personally, I think that poetry as a medium to raise awareness in racism is
Hmm.
very powerful. Because
Yeah,
as mentioned
agreed.
just now, I can read a poetry, a good poetry,
Mm-hmm.
having no idea what it meant, but
Mm-hmm.
feeling the message it's trying to deliver. So
Mm-hmm.
imagine if a poetry on raising awareness towards racism. It has the aesthetic of the words, it has the meaning embedded in it. So rather than just reading an article of why racism is bad, which is of course it's bad, but you can find 100 or 200 articles about why racism is bad, why racism is bad. But there's no connection, if I would say, because everyone knows racism is bad. But it needs someone who understands what racism is, who has gone through it, and actually
Mm-hmm.
wrote a very powerful medium, in this case with poetry, to deliver a stronger impact than any casual articles can ever do.
Mm-hmm.
That leads us to a certain. I'd like to share something about the origin of racism, because previously you mentioned in the slides that racism is basically I think that I'm better than you.
Mm.
But there's another side of racism called the racial separatism. It's not
Okay.
thinking that I'm better than you, but thinking that my race should not mingle with your race, or my race
Why?
should not get married to your race.
Right, but
We should
what's
remain
what's at
separate.
the
Yeah,
root of it, though? I mean, why not?
exactly.
So that
Yeah,
needs to be unpacked.
it's true. So it's quite interesting because even though I don't look down upon other people, but if I think like my children should only marry Malays, that is in a way racist, racial separatism.
Mm.
And I have a very interesting uh, piece to share with you.
Okay.
Okay, so Tarini, can you share the blackout? So this is a poem by A.J. Ede. So when we
Mm-hmm.
think of poetry, we think of all these short sentences on each line. But we also have, as you have experience in, visual poetry.
Mm.
Okay, so let's wait for the post to be shared. Yeah, cast the blackout poem online. Yeah, by A.J. Ede.
Oh yeah, blackout poems.
Blackout, so cool.
Yeah, they're
It
really cool.
really like redefines what poetry is.
Is it because it's more visual?
Yes, it's not just visual. Visual can be in the form of an image or a video, but in this case, it's all text. But the act of blacking out certain sentence to create a message. So by
Right.
reducing, we are emphasizing on a message, which
Right.
I think is brilliant.
Yeah, it's almost as if, if I give you a sculpture and then you kind of like chisel everything away and suddenly you have a new sculpture, something like
Yes.
that.
Okay. So meanwhile, while we wait for them to post the blackout poem up, let's go back to our roots.
Let's
So
go
our
back to
topic
the roots.
So our topic is racism and
Yes.
poetry. Okay, so I've been dilly-dallying around racism for a while. Okay, because to be honest, I'm quite worried about this topic of racism. It's quite sensitive,
Oh,
but
right.
sensitive doesn't mean it's not something that we should discuss. By
Exactly.
by being sensitive, it actually means that we should talk about it. It should not be something sensitive.
Right, right.
Okay,
Agreed.
so as you can see on the screen right now, can you make it not a background, but a screen instead? Share the screen. Okay, fine. Okay, never mind. We'll go back to that later. So
Okay.
in Malaysia, from within our families, within our blood, and up to who our leaders are. So from a family to friends to extended families to leaders, racism can be seen everywhere. It's
Mhm.
not far-fetched to say racism is a part of everyone. You don't
Mhm.
have to say it out to actually feel that you're racist. Just by thinking that all this Malay are so lazy, or
Mm.
these Indians are so gangsters. Even though you
Mm.
still have friends, but just having that inside of you is
Right.
a symptom of the whole disease, which is racism.
Right.
And in Malaysia, how
Mhm.
has poetry played a part in raising awareness towards racism
Oh,
in
wow.
Malaysia?
How has it raised awareness?
Yeah, is it an active topic in the poetry field?
Oh, it has. I don't even know of a time where Malaysian poetry hasn't addressed racism. All of the biggest names in our literary field, they have talked about it. I guess in every single collections that they have. So I have Muhammad Haji Saleh talking about it. We have Cecil Rajendra talking about it. We have Saleh bin Joni talking about it. There's so many people out there. Like one of my favorite local poets is Yi Tiang Hong, who has passed away unfortunately. But his whole collection of poetry revolves around the idea where there is this immense sadness that he is not seen as an equal in his own beloved country. And
Mm-mm.
that it's rooted in racism as well. So, how does it create awareness? I think it creates awareness because we're talking about language. Yeah. So, of course, we have poetry that is written in Bahasa, we have poetry written in English and all the other languages as well. But when we talk about language, language is political and
Mm-mm.
language can be politicized. And the
Mm-mm.
idea of racism, no matter how personal that experience can be, it did not come out of nowhere. It
Mm-mm.
is has always been a tool of power, of dominance,
Yeah.
right? I'm better than you. I don't want to mingle, with you, and so on and so forth. There's power dynamics there, and I
Mm-mm.
think whenever we try to unpack that, especially by using poetry, and I think poetry is a great tool for this because the minute when you write a poem, you can't lie to yourself, right? It's not like doing a speech. A speech you can make it sound as nice as possible and so on. But no, when it comes to writing a poem, it's very self-reflective.
Mm-mm.
And if you do not have an understanding of every single word that you choose in there and not having this purpose and this intention, I it's going to be really tough. I always when it comes to me writing my poems, I always feel a little bit overwhelmed because I also have to address whatever, maybe I do have a racist side of me that I'm not aware of, that I always have this, set of privileges where I don't have to address the certain stuff that is happening in the country. But by writing a poem for an intended audience or intended group of readers, and that would be Malaysians, of course, I have to be honest, right?
Mm-mm.
And unpack it myself.
Yeah.
So, does poetry create awareness? Has Malaysian poetry created awareness? For sure.
And have you actually wrote a piece trying to address this issue?
Oh yeah. I actually wrote quite. Actually, most of my poems do address that in one degree or another. But usually, my spoken word poetry pieces, my performance pieces, are much more explicit when it comes to that.
Mm-mm. Okay. And I think not many of us know this. Okay, so we've been
Mhm.
talking to you about poetry, and poetry. Your master's is about poetry. Your degree is on poetry. Your PhD is on
I'm
poetry.
so bored, right? I need
No,
to
no,
try
no.
new things.
The thing is, you're still doing a lot of things. You're a poet.
Mhm.
You're also associate professor now, and then at the same time, you're also technically
Assistant
okay.
professor.
You're a do I say podcast host for BFM
Uh,
89.9 Speakeasy, where
well,
we talk about literature.
yeah, I mean, I used to do that. So I hosted a whole season. So that's about a year where I collaborated with BFM and we talked about poetry, everything poetry in there. So that was fun. Am I looking forward to perhaps doing another season of that, perhaps on a different platform? Maybe, maybe not. We'll see how, Mr. Amin.
So for whoever who is not tuned in, is there like an offline version that we can refer to? The
Oh, yeah,
podcast?
definitely. So all you have to do is just Google Speak Easy.
Speak
Speak
easy.
Yeah, Speak Easy, just one word. Yeah. So Speak
Mhm.
Easy, BFM. So the podcast is there. There's basically so many episodes in there that you can actually check out.
Okay, so now on BFM. So apart
Mm.
from that, you're also the founder of Numinous.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you've been doing a lot of things. And a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it revolves around literature and art. So I'm
Mm.
going to do something bad, something evil a bit, and ask you if
Oh,
I were to take poetry away from you, what do you see yourself doing?
if you took poetry away from me,
Yeah.
what would I be doing?
Yes.
I would probably be doing something visual.
Ah.
Yeah, I'll try to translate words into pictures.
Have you actually assimilated visuals in your work?
Yeah, so for the past 2 years, I have been utterly obsessed with multimedia poetry. So it's basically poetry where you use other forms of media as well,
Mhm.
just put them together, and it's called multimedia poetry.
Ah. Okay.
Yeah,
So you do have a example to show us, which we will share with all the viewers later on.
yeah, I do.
But going back to racism, because I
Okay.
believe that a lot of our audience is interested not just in racism itself or poetry itself, but the role of poetry in racism. Okay,
Okay.
so about the role of poetry in racism, do you see it having a lifespan? Will it continue having a role in raising awareness in towards racism? Because in preparation for this podcast, I tried to look up on several sources that focuses on the function of poetry in racism, which was quite difficult to find.
Hmm.
Whenever
Hmm.
you Google it, you'll only find from the US, from Africa, from the US, from the Africa, rarely from Malaysia.
Hmm.
So what do you suggest would be a good like step forward in publicizing poetry as a medium of awareness in Malaysia?
Well, I guess it starts with empowering people to write poetry, because now I guess a lot of us tend to think that poetry is not for us, that we can't do poetry. But then, as I say, printed poetry is very different from performance poetry. It can be quite different from multimedia poetry and social media poetry, or like the one that you wanted to share just now, blackout poetry. So everyone can do it. And I think it's more of empowering the community, that they can actually use this as a tool to share on social media and basically kind of amplify the message, which is something that was pretty difficult to do, I guess, 10 years ago. Now it's much easier.
And why so?
10 years
How
ago,
was Malaysia 10 years ago?
for poetry or what?
Yeah, for poetry.
Well, okay. So when I first started out, so it's about 10 years ago, when I first, well, oh my God, I've been doing it for more than 10 years. I am so old. But anyway, 10 years ago, one of the ways for you to learn more about poetry is basically for you to, I guess, buy a book, go to an event, either as an audience or as somebody who is interested to perform or to share their works. It is, I guess, it takes a lot more effort. It might not be as accessible as it is now. 10 years ago, perhaps, in order for you to be kind of regarded as a poet, you have to get yourself published, which is a little bit of a difficulty unless if you're going for indie or independent publishers, because there's always this idea that poetry doesn't sell.
Yeah.
But why does poetry sell, right? Because there's no idea, not to say this idea, but I guess a lot of people already have this notion that there is no function to poetry, there's no value to poetry. So I think it's more of shifting one's way of looking at it. So yeah, and then now, dude, like you can actually just whip up something on a 4x4 and post it up on Instagram, and there's always a possibility of people reposting and resharing. And you're not even talking about Twitter and YouTube and so on. You're not only talking about sharing your works in Kuala Lumpur, in Malaysia. You're talking about kind of like crossing the borders as well.
Okay. That is a good segue to
Really? Okay.
It's a perfect segue to what's going to be a potentially embarrassing segment to this podcast. So you say that you can just whip out something on Instagram, on YouTube, where people will hear and go. If it goes viral, then not your career lah, but that's a good step forward. So I actually whipped up several stanzas. Do you call it stanzas? Several lines.
Stanzas, yeah.
Stanzas, yeah.
Lines or stanzas?
Huh? What? Sorry?
Lines or stanzas?
Stanzas, I guess.
Okay, all right then. Share.
All right. So, as everyone know, when writing a song, the easiest topic is about love. So my first attempt in poetry or spoken word is about love.
Okay.
Okay, so all the best to me. Let's hope I don't make a fool of myself.
Do it.
So here's how it goes. Love, a goal made up of 4 letters. Love. I've been searching through the loops, searching for what matters. Love. Is it listen, overcome, value, and encourage? Love. Or is it lies, oppress, validate, and cage? If love is the latter, then I'd rather be alone, atone for the things I've done, hoping you'd share your throne. But now, as I close my eyes shut, everything is clear cut. That you, my love, is nothing else but a stepping stone. How was it?
You know, for our first try, that's really good.
That took me quite a while.
Yeah.
I wanted to write something about more serious issues, okay?
No,
more serious issues of the
start with
world than
something
love.
that is closer to you, I guess.
Would that be something that will go viral? Is that worthy of attention?
It really depends on how you perform it.
How was my performance just now?
It was, I guess, what's the
Out of
word?
10. Out of 10.
Out of 10. Out of 10. Ooh, I would give it a 6.
Oh, so a B minus.
Yes.
Not bad for my first try. Okay.
Exactly.
Not bad. Definitely not bad.
I should definitely not give a 9 because it's just not going to be easy for you after this, you know? You have to always start slow.
If you start high, the only way forward is down. But now if you start somewhere in the middle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You need to make as many mistakes as possible in the beginning and not later.
True. And if our audience think that that's pretty good, although I've been reading the comments now, everyone is cringing.
I'm seeing Jian Heng Tan cringed.
I know. I'm trying. Yep. Maybe later IMW can organize a poetry slam between the lecturers and the students. Who knows?
Yeah. I think that'd be
Pitch perfect
awesome.
style.
Right? We should ask Jian Heng Tan to participate.
For sure.
Yes.
Note that down, Jian Heng Tan.
Remember the name.
Down. Okay, so now going back to the main topic, right?
Okay.
So I found something that's quite interesting about racism. I'd like to share with
Mm,
all of you. So when we talk about racism, it's not something that appeared out of nowhere.
mm,
Okay? We have all these videos about, oh, babies have no idea what racism is, and then it's the society that implanted the idea of racism in kids, which is true. But if you were to go back to the how racism started, okay, and
mm,
I'm specifically talking about the white community and the black community.
mhm,
Interestingly, I read a paper on this
mm,
actual
mhm,
history. So in the year around the 1500s to the 1600s,
mhm.
when the European countries went to Africa, they found that Africa is actually really technologically advanced, similar
Right.
to the US and the European. And even in the documentation, in the script, in the manuscript, they acknowledged Africa as being a rival, a competitor in terms of development.
Mhm.
But as years go by, as decades go by, as centuries go by, the European countries and the US, they start to be more advanced, technologically advanced, both in terms of warfare and also in terms of in general.
Right.
So then it led to plundering, invasion, colonization, and all the Africans were forced to be slave laborers. And
Mhm,
that was the moment that this issue of racism between the white community and the black community actually started.
mhm.
So that actually quite is really interesting to me because who knew that in the year 1500s and 1600s, Africa is as evolved or as developed as the other, I would say, the main powers of the world.
Well,
And
I'm
yeah,
actually not surprised by it as well at all because if you were to look at the the really ancient civilizations, I mean, they came from basically Africa, right? Africa, and
yeah,
then at that part, even now, like the way that we see the world, the way that we see the map of the world, it's not how it used to look like. It's basically a standardized version, and it's based on those who have explored the world, who started noting it down and do the mapping, the cartography, and so on. And they are Europeans.
mm-mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, true. And then if you to go back to how poetry was being originally used, poetry was
Mm,
being used as a form of recording history. So the
right.
power to record history or deliver history is in the hands, or in this case, is in the tongue of who gave the recording. So if I were
Okay.
to modify some history and deliver it to my kids, then it will appear in how I envisioned it. So as you mentioned just now, it's correct. In which it's all about who won, basically. Who
I
won?
mean, what they said, history belongs to those who won the war, right?
Yeah. Mm, true. But fortunately, that's no longer the case. Okay, now we've learned that the human civilization, everything started in Africa, and we've learned that Africa themselves are very modern and developed compared
Of
to
course,
other
of course.
nations in the 15th and the 16th century. And I'm so tempted to talk, as being a geneticist myself,
Mhm.
I'm quite tempted to talk about genetics in the black and white community, but I
Mhm.
think I'll save that for another session.
Yeah.
Okay, because it has nothing to do with poetry. It's just my
Basically, what you can actually do is perhaps you can write a poem about it.
poems about racial
Genetics.
genetics.
Yeah, for sure.
True.
Mm.
Okay, so in the field of academic research, yeah, I'm quite
Okay.
interested because we have papers, publications focusing on poets in, for example, summarizing or what's the word? Um, not not this. Basically, to take a a poem,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
trying to understand it. That can be a research paper itself.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. A
Yeah.
literary analysis. Got it.
Yeah, true. So in the field of poetry, okay, has there been any like breakthrough in the field of poetry, which you are aware of?
Breakthrough
Breakthrough, yeah,
in the field of poetry.
yeah. Because as you mentioned
Well,
just now, when we talk about poetry, we always say poetry has no value, it has no function. but that's not the case now.
Got it. I don't think it's a breakthrough though, because
Mm.
I always, when I study and do research in poetry, and if you just look at the history of literature itself, history of poetry, it's basically the same cycle of change. It has never remained one way for a very long time because everybody keeps on responding to it. They have a new school of thought, a new way of writing poetry. However, I guess one thing that really caught my eye, and it was it really caught the attention of the academics in particular. It's the popularity of poetry on social media platforms, especially like Instagram, because you're talking about those. We tend to have an idea that, oh, only a specific sort of person would be writing poetry that is considered good,
Yeah.
right? Like you have to be published by journals. You have to, have a degree or have a really like this turmoil of a life. In the case of Bukowski and so on and so forth, they have to be problematic. No, of course not. I mean, Rupi Kaur has sold way more books than some of the biggest names in literature,
Mm.
and she shares all of that at first on social media, because the ones who are buying her books are no longer 30-year-olds or 20-year-olds. You're talking about teenagers, the young adults. And I think that has really changed the way we see poetry and perhaps what poetry is. But I do have to point out that it also brings into the question that you first asked me in this session of ours, and you say, what is good poetry? So that was the
Mm.
argument when it comes to Rupi Kaur as well.
Whoopi Kaur.
Yeah, Rupi Kaur.
So about books, even you
Yeah.
yourself are both the author and also the editor of some books.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So would you like to share with us some of your books? You published 2 books lately, right?
Yeah,
For the
I
past,
published
yeah.
for the past quite a few years because it takes a long time. So this is my first book.
Okay.
It's called Rhymes for Mending Hearts, and this is my second book, which is more recent, and it's called All the Bodies We've Embraced. And yeah, and aside from that, I have had my poems, not me, but basically my poems being selected for anthologies and so on and so forth.
My
Not
poems,
me.
not me.
Yeah, I know, I told you, right? It's no longer mine.
Okay, so you showed us some books, and now I'm going to show with the audience a brief multimedia poetry, which you shared with me previously. Let me cast my
Okay.
screen for a while. So while I cast my screen, can you give us a brief background
Yes,
on this
I would love
poetry?
to do that. So this is the intention behind this poem is to look into the etymology of words. Basically, every single word is a world of its own. So I wanted to break it down and try to bridge whatever that we think is happening in the States and not that is not happening here. So that was the intention, to show that we might think that someone else is having it worse than us, but we are also going through the same issues, and we are also partly guilty, and we have to be part of the solution as well. So this one is not the one that I wanted to talk about. But anyway, so this also has something to do with etymology of language. I called this the uncrooked line. It is a form of multimedia poetry, like I mentioned earlier. So it's a combination of words and visuals. And I did everything on the phone, which again is very empowering for any one of you watching right now who you think that you can't do it. Well, you can. All you need to do is just give it a try. Okay. Penurunan janin dari langit rahim is akin to the descent of a holy revelation. Daripada ribut badai tubuh badan sampailah ke gelora gelisah suara. They are equal in their escalation of anxiety and disorientation, daripada denyut nadi di ubun-ubun to the kala-kala of its punctuation. Mungkin kerana dunia ini yang bernama As-Siratal Mustaqim, the uncrooked line that bridges the softly pressed pith of a body to the kalam scarlet ink, Jadi setiap nafas yang diambil adalah sebuah huruf yang membawa kita makin hampir ke pangkuan Tuhan. We are written not as a book of pride, but of guidance, which is why I'm asking you this. Would you hold my hand? Mengapa begitu gian akan tibanya Yaumuddin? Bukankah titian ini sudah lama tertulis? Bukankah titian ini intipatinya ala Qudus? There is only loss in burning bridges. There is only loss in pushing others off just to get nowhere.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
And that's the thing about literature. Okay? You can have no idea what it means, but you'll be lying if you say you felt nothing. Okay? So even for me, like whenever I think of your performances, okay, so I've been to several of your performances. Okay, you have your colleagues giving poetry. So poetry has a very powerful way of making you feel something, even if the semantics is lost, even if the meaning is lost, but the aesthetic value of the word can evoke an emotion out of people. And this is something, as a scientist, I'm truly jealous of.
Why?
Because I try to communicate all the things about biology, about science, and people are like, huh? What? Okay. But for me, I'm so excited. Oh, biology is cool. Biology is interesting. Biology is life, blah, 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 blah. Okay. But if the students are not interested in it, then you'll get lost in translation.
Right.
Yeah. So previously you mentioned that you have discovered a whole new field of poetry and science.
Yeah.
Which I think I should definitely explore.
Yes.
Maybe I can assimilate poetry in how I speak to my audience. Maybe the choice of words to evoke an emotion about photosynthesis or of cellular respiration.
Right.
But how have you actually assimilated science in your work?
Well, I do more reading now. So because you teach biology and you are a geneticist and all, I'm not. I did very badly when I was in high school for biology. I got the lowest for that. I think I failed. But anyway, what I understand now, and then because I'm obsessed with the idea that we are all poems, but it's so easy, right, to say, oh, I'm a poem, but how do I actually try to get another person to see what I'm trying to see? And what I do is that I do a lot of research in terms of body parts and how certain organs work, and try to replicate that and use it as a metaphor or symbol in my poem. And I noticed that even the way that I write has changed as well. Because sometimes people tend to rely only on words, and it's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. But now in the 21st century, we're talking about, this idea where the whole world, that this ocean of knowledge is at the tip of your finger. All you have to do is just start typing it or just turn on your handphone, right? And to be able to fuse all branches of knowledges together, because I think it's over this idea of disciplines, different disciplines. We should not think about specializing just in one. I think we should talk about a very holistic idea of what knowledge is. Like a person and a human being can be a geneticist, can be a musician, can be a poet, can be an artist, and so on and so forth, instead of just one.
True. And continuing that, I love when you mention about this nowadays as we approach a future in education or a future in civilization as in general, we should start not destroying, but making the walls that breaks down all these disciplines to be not walls anymore. Disciplines should not be different. Disciplines should be integrated, as you mentioned about poetry and science.
Right.
True. So even when you talk about biology, you cannot escape chemistry. And even when you talk about talking to others, maybe in the form of psychology, poetry does play a part in how you communicate with people.
Right. Wait, actually, I forgot to tell you. Like, do you know, like, okay, so in my introduction to poetry classes,
Mm.
my first few slides, I actually used the picture of not to say a cut up. It's not the real thing. It's just a picture of a frog, an experiment where you cut up the frog and then you have the
Mm.
body parts, and that's how you learn about biology.
Yeah.
I think so. Right. We tend to have that in school. I skipped that class, by the way.
Mm.
Anyway, so
Okay.
yeah, so I actually use that, and then my students actually say like, "Oh, we never thought that we'll be seeing this picture in your slides when it comes to poetry." But I'm like, that's the thing. There's a difference between cutting things up and trying to understand the meaning of a poem by taking this and taking that, as opposed to just feeling, i.e., looking at the beauty of that little frog.
That little unfortunate frog.
Yes, unfortunate frog.
Unfortunate frog. And okay, so now we are actually at the end of our podcast, although I could still go on for another half an hour.
Oh,
Time went by
yeah,
very quick. Time went by
very
very quickly.
quick.
But I do have several questions personally.
Hmm.
Okay, before we pass the floor to the audience, to the Q&A to the
Right.
audience.
Yeah.
Have there been instances? So we've been talking about poetry as a medium for raising awareness towards racism, but in the field of poetry itself, are there
Hmm.
instances of racism? Maybe because
Ooh.
I'm of another different color, I don't get as many opportunities to go on the stage,
Oh,
for example.
simple. We know about the Jungle Book, right? The story
Yeah.
Jungle Book, Mowgli, and all that. So if you were to look at that, and then around the same sort of period, you have this particular poet named Rudyard Kipling, who's a
Mm-hmm.
basically a British colonialist, and I guessed perhaps at that time when he wrote that poem, I think it's called if I'm not mistaken, IF. When he wrote that poem, he really thought that there was nothing wrong with it. But that's the thing about being part of any community where you are the majority, that you have the confidence of being right
Mm-hmm.
without really caring about what other, perhaps the minorities have to say to respond to that. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes, that is a great example of that. And even if you were to look at this is Western literature, of course. When it comes to Malaysian literature, because we come from an oral sort of tradition where a lot of things are not written down, that the minute when it becomes written down, there is already this narrative that you might not be able to see blatant racism in a poem, but there is a
Mm.
lot of underlying racism, perhaps.
Okay.
I cannot name names, but yeah,
Definitely,
you
definitely.
tend to have that, yeah.
Mm. And then about, okay, so forgive me for my ignorance. So how was the Jungle Book wrong? How was
Not the
it
Jungle Book,
inappropriate?
not the
Yeah.
Jungle Book. It's this a poem is called If. It's written by Rudyard Kipling, so it's around the same
Mm.
period, right?
Okay.
And even the Jungle Book can be problematic as well, right? So the idea of the colored person as savage, which is a very
Oh, okay.
European imperialist point of view. So Rudyard Kipling's poem also looks at the idea of the white man's burden, that it is upon them to save the world. And that is, if you were to read it in 21st century, I guess even then, if you are somebody who's not white, you might be reading it and going like, wait a minute, there's something wrong,
Mm.
right? So
True, true,
yeah.
yeah. Okay, so thank you. So now that leads us to our final segment of today. Okay,
Yay.
so we have quite a number of questions from the
Q&A.
audience Q&A.
Q&A.
So Tarini, yeah, can you highlight some questions and put it on the screen? So we have a question from Nur Zahira. Do you think racism impacts our country?
It has impacted our country.
Hmm.
It has been going quite a long time. And I'm talking about the fact that whatever that we are experiencing right now, it is the traces of what that has been happening even before we achieved our independence. Because we do have to remember that Malaysia is used to be colonized not only by the Dutch, but especially by the British Empire. And with colonization comes oppression and comes the idea of one group of people being better than the other, and also the idea of dividing a community so that you can control them better. So we are still experiencing the after effects of that particular period, that traumatic period of Malaysian history. So yes, it has, it is, and it can if we allow it to continue. So hence, people need to be more empowered to use the tool that they want to use. Poetry can be one of them.
Okay. Next, can we have a question from Miss Tarini?
Oh, that's a
I
nice
read a
picture.
research that says that the effect of racism can be genetically inherited. When something is so deeply embedded in ourselves, how would you overcome it?
Okay.
So it sounds like a question for me, but let's start with you first.
No. I think we should start with you. So it's basically it's a two-part question, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So how is it genetically inherited?
So
I mean,
I'll
I
answer the
agree.
first part.
On.
Yeah. Then you can answer the second part. So number one, genetically, racism cannot be inherited.
Okay.
There's no such thing as a racism genes. There are genes for your color, skin color, but there's no genes for racism. And then when we
Okay.
talk about diversity, so we tend to think that okay, in Malaysia we're a very diverse country, so we have
Okay.
racism and all that here and there. In all countries we have racism, but in terms of genetics, Malaysia is far less diverse than Africa. Globally, Africa is the most diverse country, and their genes are the most diverse. So racism, what we are experiencing between either we're thinking we are the one who is oppressing or the oppressed, genetics have nothing to do with it.
Right.
Genetics will govern your biological look, your phenotype, but in no way will it influence how you treat people. That is more societal.
Right. Well, okay, I guess yeah, I guess I agree to that as well because now we are going into the world of genetics, which I am completely ignorant of. As of now, like, I can learn more about it. However, I do also believe that trauma can pass from one generation to the other, which I don't think has anything to do with genetics. I think it's more of yeah, there's another part of it. I call it collective trauma because I'm reading the question by Ms. Tarini where he says the effect of racism. And if you can have perhaps, let's just say, a group of people who have gone through major trauma for, let's just say, 200 years, you can still see the effects of that even long after the ones who have experienced it passed on. Ooh, I can't hear you. What?
Okay, so next question is by Tijani. Tijani
Okay.
Ashley.
Hey, but how do we overcome it?
Okay, sorry.
One day at a time, Mr. Aini. Read up, do something about it, okay? I
Yeah.
look forward to your poems.
And I'm not being pessimistic over here, okay?
Yeah,
But deep inside, deep rooted in me, I don't think that racism can ever be demolished. I think we might be able to not bring it out onto the world,
right.
okay, by laws and regulations here and there. But what's in here, what's in here is difficult to eradicate. So in the
Okay.
near future, I don't think we should aim to completely obliterate racism from the face of the earth. That can be something in far in the future. So as you mentioned, let's take steps by step, small
Yeah,
steps and small steps and small steps.
exactly. Because you know, our history of humanity is a history of violence. Yeah, it's like violence after violence, a lot of remembering and forgetting and never learning. And I think that's the reason why you know, like all of the single, you know, when we talk about knowledge, how everything should be more cohesive. You know, you have the arts, expression of the arts that basically point out what's wrong with the community, but then you also have policymakers and then, you know, the lawmakers to ensure that not to not to completely delete it from human sort of idea, because again, I agree with you and I don't think that we're being pessimistic. I think we're being realistic
Yeah.
as well, because how on earth do you do that sort of a change, but as you say, one day at a time.
Yes. Okay, thank you. The next question. So let's take two more questions, including this one.
Yeah.
I was working towards publishing a poetry book with Patridge.
Ooh,
I
poetry.
stopped due to anxiety that it won't sell. What should I prepare for in regards to publishing a poetry book to help me overcome anxiety?
Oh, okay, right. Um, I understand the anxiety. I think I had quite a number of panic attacks before my first book came out, and that's not even with a major brand as Partridge, right? So I guess one of the ways that you can actually do it, Tijani, or is it Ashley? Tijani, Ashley, is for you to perhaps to come up with a sampler. So maybe come up with a poetry zine. Choose 10 to 20 poems and you can publish it yourself, self publication, so that you don't have to, so that the pressure is lower. So you can start just to sell it to those who you know or those who know you and get more feedback. I think feedback is really important, and feedback is missing in the poetry scene in Malaysia. There's a lot of people who just sharing but not getting their thoughts on what they think about the poems. So hopefully that will help. Good luck.
I would like to add on to that. So, in
Mm,
terms of publishing a poetry or selling it,
mm,
would sharing it on Instagram and all these social media platform beforehand as just a
mm,
free sharing, will it affect personally from you from selling
mm,
books? Does sharing online affect
mm.
the sales of books?
No, I don't think so, because I always think of social media as just another version of a page, you know. So when you have a book, it's for a specific target audience, and when it comes to books, you know, it's physical, it's an object, right? It's a different thing. It's a different experience of consuming poetry as opposed to social media platform. That's the reason why when I do post on my Instagram, if it's a video, it's about 1 minute in length. Whereas when I do performance and it's paid performances, it'll be 3 to 5 minutes per poem. And the same thing goes with my poetry, printed poetry as well. It's designed and shaped for social media.
Okay, thank you. So that was a beautiful answer for this question. Let's take a final question from Jan Heng Tan.
All right. Does
Does,
diasporic writing
I'm thinking of how to pronounce it. Yeah.
does diasporic writing encourage hint of racism views, racist view? So so I guess okay. So I'm trying to respond to this question because when you talk about diasporic writing, so those who, you know, those who migrate from one country to the other, so those either by, well, basically whether or not they have the intention to do so, whether they actually want to do so, right? So diasporic writing, you can write whatever you want to write. I mean, it's basically based on the writers and the poets, but I think it's more of how you receive it. We do need to remember that the reason why we have literature and you have the science, the humanities, is basically to encourage people to be more critical. You don't have to accept everything 100%. And that's the reason why I also think that feedback is very important. So if it does encourage hints of racism, I think it does bring forth the question on how did the reader get to that and whether or not the writer is open to having a conversation about it, which is where social media comes in lah. So
Mm,
yes.
okay. So I hope that that answer actually enlightened the question given. And while listening to you explain, a
Mm.
question came to my mind. If
Oh, okay.
so let's take one more question
Inspired.
from me. Yeah, that question inspired me. The word diasporic inspired me.
Mm.
So when we talk about racism, so in the
Mm.
US, there's always a case of censorship, censorship, censorship. So if as an author, as a
Mhm.
poet, for example, I wanted
Mhm.
to publish poetry which
Mhm.
has a small hint of racism here and there.
Okay.
And everyone is telling me, no, it's bad, it's
Mhm.
racist, don't publish it, don't publish it, don't publish it.
Mm.
Okay? But as a poet yourself, do you think that I should go on and publish it as a mean to deliver a message that I feel is right? Is it considered censorship?
Well, if you stop yourself from doing it, right? So there are two ways of looking at it. It's either you're self-censoring, you know, because you want
Mm,
to appease those around you, but also it kind of brings to mind the like if somebody says that it is racist, then you have to be self-reflective, aren't you? Like
Yeah.
who is going to be a target audience? What do you want? What is going to be the ripples of effect that's going to come from that? So
Mm,
yeah, and we don't even have to look at the states. Yeah, we have censorship here in Malaysia as well.
true. Yeah. So basically, no matter how strong you feel, think
Mm,
before you do
yeah,
something. Think before you
right.
publish anything.
But if you still want to see how it goes, and that's a huge risk to take, you can always go to Twitter, which I no longer use because that is so scary. But yeah, and see what the feedback is.
True. So unfortunately, so now we are at the end of the podcast session. But I'm sure our audience is thinking of where can we get in touch with you and what are your upcoming projects that we can attend. Because to the viewers now, believe me, I was not into poetry before, but I
Mhm,
went to one of Dr. Sheena's performances, and now I'm
mhm.
basically a believer.
Whew!
Okay? I'm in the poetry religion now. If you have the opportunity, by all means, please go and see a performance by Dr. Noshina. So with that,
Right.
yeah, Dr. Shina, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. That's a huge compliment to actually convert Mr. Amin into
Yeah.
the religion of poetry. Okay. So yeah, so I've already shared it here. So once you share it to the screen, so I can talk about it.
Okay.
There's a lot of stuff that has been happening. So this is just for you to know. I'm not performing anytime soon because of the CMCO, but I am planning a few things, yeah, in the project. So this is what I'm working on at the moment. So as I said, right, we're talking about multimedia, and we're talking about accessibility, and we're talking about racism, which is basically discrimination of minorities. So now I'm working on this project. It's called Deaf Poetry. And the idea is to translate deaf poetry written obviously by someone who is deaf or who has disability in hearing disability. So from translating that into multimedia poetry, from sign language to poetry on social media. So I'm working on that. I am also hosting an event on Wednesday this week. So in 2 days, yeah. So we'll be doing a lot of sharing of poetry and so on and so forth. But that's more passive. That's you just watching. That's islanded. But if you do want to learn or basically jump headfirst into the deep end of multimedia poetry, I will be doing a workshop on constructing a multimedia poem, and that's on the 12th of August from 4 to 6. It's free. All you have to do is just email me, and it will let you know exactly what the platform will be using for that. So if you're interested, just email me. Yeah. All right. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Shina, thank you so much for being a part of this podcast
Thank
organized
you
by
for inviting
CFS.
me.
It's definitely an honor to have you with us. Because personally, I feel like the field of like podcast, we always talk about education, technology. It's good to have a mix of all fields. And we hope this is one of many events where we put the spotlight on literature and on poetry. Who knows? We
Woo!
might have you back with us in the future.
Yay! Let's do that. I mean, think about it. Poetry Slam, University of Malaya, Wales edition.
True. Can you imagine a poetry slam between universities?
Yeah, we were
Oh,
working on that a couple of
oh,
years ago,
really?
but yeah, yeah.
Have
So
there
we,
been any such events?
no. Still trying.
Okay, great. So again, thank you, Dr. Nishina. Have a nice day. And now I will pass the torch back to my MC, Julia.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
So that marks the event. That marks the end of our event. For today, I would like to remind to all of you who have attended today's session but have not registered yet to do so by clicking the link in the comment section, or you can just go straight forward to our Instagram page in Instagram bio. It's called let's talk.iumw. Certificates will be only given to those who has registered and successfully participate in both sessions, or which is today and on coming Wednesday. So thank you so much, Dr. Sheena and Mr. Amin, for your presence and knowledge sharing.
Thank you
Thank
so much,
you to the
Julia.
Center of Foundation. Thank you so much. Thank you to Center of Foundation Studies for this great opportunity. And last but not least, thank you all for attending today's session, for tuning in. Have a good day, and we hope to see you soon in our next session, in the next webinar on our CFS webinar. Thank you.